Welcome back. In the previous two steps, we created couple of simple methods. In this step, we'll try and understand what's happening in the background. You'd see the mappings that we have created. So we created a mapping from hello world get. We also created a hello world bean get. But there are additional mappings also present in here. For example, slash error. When we look at the log, there are a few important questions that would come up. What is dispatcher servlet? Actually, we have not done anything about dispatcher servlet. So who is configuring dispatcher servlet? What does dispatcher servlet do? How does the hello world bean object get converted to JSON? And who is configuring the error mapping? So there are a lot of questions that you would have based on whatever we have done in the previous two steps and whatever was in the log. In this step, we'll slowly look at all these questions. I would want to actually start running this application in something called debug mode. And the way we can do that is by going to application.properties and configuring logging.level. I would only configure the Spring framework. So org.spring framework is equal to, I would say, debug. So I'm setting the logging level for org.spring framework to debug, and let's restart. When you restart now, you'd see a lot more log than previously, because now we are at debug logging. Spring Boot is outputting a lot of stuff, and all that is being shown in the log right now. One of the important things that you would see in here is something called an auto configuration report. The auto configuration report consists of a lot of details. If you look at the auto configuration log, one of the important things is configuration of dispatcher servlet auto configuration. It says dispatcher servlet auto configuration matched because it found a class called dispatcher servlet on the class path. What is happening here is we added in a starter on Spring Boot starter web, and Spring Boot starter web has a dependency on Spring Web MVC framework. Therefore, we get the dispatcher servlet class in our class path. So Spring Boot auto configuration says, I found dispatcher servlet on the class path. So let's go ahead and configure a dispatcher servlet. The other thing you would see is also error MVC auto configuration. So it says, okay, these classes are found on the class path. So we would need to configure a error page. So it's configuring a basic error controller, a few error attributes, and also a default error view resolver. The error page which we looked at earlier was the white label error page. This was the thing which was generating that error page. In summary, all this configuration is getting fired because of something called Spring Boot auto configuration. Spring Boot looks at all the classes, all the jars which are available on the class path, and based on whatever is in the class path, it tries to auto configure different things like dispatcher servlet. In addition to whatever we have discussed earlier, the other things which are auto configured are things called HTTP message converters. So we had the bean automatically converted to JSON, right? So these HTTP message converters were responsible for doing that. So what is happening is something called Jackson to object mapper. So this actually does the conversion from JSON to beans and beans to JSON. Who's configuring dispatcher servlet? Spring Boot auto configuration. How does the hello world bean get converted to JSON? It's also because of Spring Boot auto configuration, because the message converters and the Jackson beans are getting initialized. Who's configuring the error mapping? Again, Spring Boot auto configuration. It creates a default error page for us. Now, the last thing we would want to understand is the dispatcher servlet. If you look at the log, you'd see something like this: mapping servlet, dispatcher servlet to slash. What is happening here is dispatcher servlet is handling all the requests. So this is the root of the web application, right? So it's handling all the requests. Whenever you type a URL into the browser, whenever I type hello world bean into the browser, what would happen is the request would go to dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet would be the one which would be handling that request first. This is following a pattern called front controller. Dispatcher Servlet is the front controller for Spring Web MVC framework. So the request goes to Dispatcher Servlet. Dispatcher Servlet knows all the different mappings which are present in the application. So it knows hello world get method is mapped to this method. Dispatcher Servlet knows that hello world bean get request is mapped to this specific method. So once it gets the request, it determines which is the right controller to execute that request. So it looks at the URI and the request method. When we type a URL in the browser, we are sending a get request. The dispatcher servlet says, okay, there's a get request to hello world bean. Which is the right controller that would be able to execute it for me? It will find this specific method. It would see that hello world controller.hello world bean is the right one to execute. So it would execute that. So it would make sure that this method is executed and this bean is returned back. Once the bean is returned back, then dispatcher servlet looks at how do I send the response back. I have a bean. Now how do I send the message back? So we have a at rest controller annotation in here. Part of the at rest controller annotation, if you look at it, is something called response body annotation. One of the important annotations which is present in REST controller is response body. What would happen when I put response body on a controller is the response from that would be mapped by a message converter into some other format. So here the message converter which is going to be used is Jackson. So dispatcher servlet would say, okay, do the Jackson conversion, do the conversion to JSON. It would actually convert hello world bean, whatever content is there in there, it converts it into JSON and sends the response back. The hello world bean request goes to dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet finds the hello world controller, the specific method hello world bean. It calls it, gets the bean, invokes the conversion on it, converts it into JSON and returns the response back. Whether you're working with web applications or with Spring REST web services, dispatcher servlet plays a key role. We will further discuss about dispatcher servlet when we talk about other things like security. In this step, we tried to take a quick look at the world behind this hello world controller. We looked at dispatcher servlet and how it controls the entire flow. Also, we looked at some of the things which are configured by default by Spring Boot auto configuration. If a few of these things are not really clear to you, not a problem at all. We will discuss about these a lot more in the subsequent steps. Until then, bye-bye.